The story of Upbuild began in a monastery. On our quest to understand ourselves more deeply, we recognize that it is our attachment to our egos, our identities, that gets in the way of being our true selves. This podcast will help you understand your ego. It will help you better understand your inner world, the motivations, insecurities, and emotions that affect your every action and relationship. Welcome to Upbuilding the Self.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Upbuilding the Self. I am Michael Sloyer, and I am here with my friend and my partner, and also my host. A month ago, I was in London for my friend's wedding, and I got this incredible opportunity to be with you, Vipin, and your family on your kid's birthday. So thank you for hosting me.
I would say I got the incredible opportunity to host you on the day after your birthday. So it was such a treat to overlap in that way and get a whole day together. I loved it.
And you've also just been to Belgium for a spiritual retreat. And you were just sharing with me a little bit about your experience. And for those that might be on audio rather than video, Vipin is glowing right now from his experience.
I don't know about that. My experience was a glowing one, but I don't know that I'm glowing.
Well, good. And I'm really excited for this conversation today because we are going to be discussing a framework that you shared with me a couple of years back, I think after having taken a workshop yourself. And it's been a really impactful one for myself in my own life, also in my coaching practice. What is this framework? And also, where did you first learn about it?
Yeah. So the framework that you're referring to is the concept of a comfort zone, a stretch zone, and a panic zone. It's a very useful framework for thinking about situations that we find ourselves in. Those situations can be of varying degrees of familiarity and challenge. And we can be completely at ease in one situation and very uncomfortable in another. And that's primarily based on our experiences, right? What we have already experienced and know is more likely to be comfortable. And what's new to us is more likely to be uncomfortable. And then our past experience with things that are new to us also will impact the degree of comfort and discomfort. How do I do when I'm in a situation that is completely new? Or if I had a traumatic experience with something new, and then that starts to make me feel more uncomfortable. And also our degree of comfort and discomfort is not fixed. It's just a useful tool for thinking about these different scenarios in our lives is this framework of the comfort, stretch, and panic zones. Obviously, the idea of a comfort zone and the importance of getting outside of your comfort zone is familiar to most people. But I learned about this particular conception, framework of comfort, stretch, and panic in this workshop that I attended. It was the North American Leadership Jam in 2021. These are events that really bring together 20 to 30 people, change makers for a week of networking and skill sharing and community building. The organization is called Yes.
So how would you define the comfort zone to start with?
Comfort zone is things that are familiar and easy. I know the situation. I've been in it before, maybe many times, and I know what to do. And it also includes situations that were once perhaps uncomfortable, but are no longer so because they're now familiar and easy to deal with. Stretch zone is where I'm much less comfortable. I feel challenged, but I'm still able to learn and grow from the situation. I can listen to others. I can listen to what's happening inside myself. I can be present. I can engage in the situation, and I can stay in the discomfort. Our hearts are usually beating a little bit faster in this zone, but after hanging out in my stretch zone, my comfort zone expands. So the panic zone is where I'm so far outside of my comfort zone that I no longer have the ability to be fully present in the situation. I'm no longer able to engage. I'm no longer able to listen. I'm in panic. I've gone into fight or flight. And that can look very different for different people. So it may look loud and crazy for someone, it's like just freaking out. And for somebody else, it may look quiet and calm because the person is completely retreated into their shell and they're frozen.
So it seems like the big distinction between stretch and comfort is that I can have presence in both of them, but I'm growing in the stretch zone where I'm not growing in the comfort zone. And then the key distinction between stretch and panic is that I can have presence in the stretch zone.
Yeah. Yeah. In some ways, I think in the comfort zone, you may even have less presence because it's almost automatic. But I think the key distinction between comfort and stretch is like ease. There's ease and familiarity and comfort. And then there's challenge, discomfort. And you can feel like I'm learning and growing because I've not done this before. You feel the expansion.
Good. I was experiencing some discomfort myself when I was talking about presence in the comfort zone, because I was thinking I'm in the comfort zone all the time, and I experienced myself as not having a lot of presence all the time. So that actually didn't match up so well. So I appreciate the correction there.
I think that is really helpful because I in some ways, the stretch zone necessitates presence because when you're in a new situation, the senses are more heightened. And so I need to be much more vigilant, much more observant of everything that's happening. And so I think among all of those, presences peaks in the stretch zone, and it's probably less in comfort and way less in panic. A couple other things I think may be helpful to just mention as it relates to this concept is that the same situation might be in the comfort zone for one person, the stretch zone for another, and the panic zone for still another person. And the point is not comparison, but it's awareness. Because when I'm aware of where I'm at, then I can orient myself accordingly and I can shift as needed, depending on what zone I'm in. And also, even for the same individual, what one day I might experience in my stretch zone, another day I might find that I'm in my panic zone. And that could be based on stress levels, what happened immediately before that I'm bringing into the situation I'm in, how poorly I slept the night before. So these things are quite malleable.
Okay, good. So let's get into an example to help illustrate this, either from your own life or from your client.
There's so many examples from our work with clients because basically this is what coaching is all about, is helping people situate themselves in their stretch zone. I was thinking about a client who was the deep discomfort of firing a C-level executive for the first time. And that was definitely outside of their comfort zone. But going through that process, it actually unlocked a much higher performance orientation across the organization. Another example is just coaching someone this week around this topic of getting vulnerable with your boss about not feeling so secure in the relationship with your boss. That seems highly uncomfortable for anyone for that matter, but with this individual. And, it was amazing to see the response, hearing the response back that I don't ever want you to sit with these feelings for so long and let them go unaddressed. Like, I'm so glad we're talking about this because obviously there's some, miscommunications, misunderstandings. So just looking at what can be some of the impact of moving outside of your comfort zone. One other example I would share is there's a client who was leaving a job after 20 years in that job. And, even within that job, there was zones of stretch and comfort stretch and probably panic as well. But there was also a security of like, this has been my identity for 20 years. And taking the step, working through that over a long period of time, stepping outside of their comfort zone to not knowing what they were going to do next, but led to the search for deeper meaning and purpose. All of those were examples from my coaching work. And it made me think, like, how do we do this consistently on our own?
Each of those examples illustrated a different impetus for moving outside of the comfort zone. So it could be where I see that the pain of not changing becomes so great. In the example you shared with the CEO, the pain of keeping this person around and not firing them became a big enough issue and would have created an even bigger ripple effect over time if that person was let to be, that it was like, I actually have to get out of my comfort zone in order to do this.
Yes, but and you can argue that might have been there for a long time. So then what is the catalyst that met someone, now I have to act?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So if we're talking about how the pain of not changing, in order for somebody to change, the pain of not changing has to be higher than the pain of changing. Either we're forced into that situation where the pain just gets there, or, and maybe this is a more powerful way of operating, is we ourselves are willing to do enough introspection or hard work where we start looking at things and we see how the pain of not changing is high relative to the pain of changing.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I mean, in the third example, if you think about what's the pain of not changing, that's really internally motivated, like the desire for something more, something different. That may be akin to a lot of, an individual wanting to grow themselves, but the status quo situation was really good. So then there's not a need to, I really appreciate what you're saying. Sometimes, like, there's enough pain in the situation that causes that becomes a forcing mechanism to move outside of your comfort zone. But there are also, many situations where actually it might not be because there's pain in the existing situation, but there's something that is outside of that situation that I have a desire for. So it's not being driven by pain, but maybe prospect.
I think we're saying the same thing in different words here. That person staying at their job became painful because of wherever they were going was a strong enough pull where that was so attractive at that. It's actually a similar experience to what I experienced when I left Goldman and joined Upbuild. Now, a lot of people would say that was, I was leaving a comfortable situation to go into something that was more risky. And for me, it had been so many years of thinking about making a move. At the time that I did it, it didn't feel like a stretch zone to me because it was like,
I was going to ask you that. I was going to say, I'm curious what zone you were in.
It felt like a stretch zone earlier on in the years leading up to it as I explored it more. But at the time of leaving the investment banking world, it didn't feel like it was a stretch zone because I had enough clarity and conviction.
I mean, I would assert that there's still it's still a huge move to go from your job and your identity as an investment banker and then come and start working at Upbuild. The decision was clear, but then there's still all these other things that you're probably, I remember when I joined Upbuild, I had a clarity and I found myself in my stretch zone quite often in those first months. I mean, still today, but like, especially in those months where I'm like, did I make the right decision? What is this thing that I'm doing? How will other people see this? Would still keep coming back up.
With the examples that you shared, how does having an awareness of this framework help to propel one to grow and to get into zones that they may not have experienced before?
Learning doesn't happen in the comfort zone because everything is known there. And learning also doesn't happen in the panic zone because our presence and our engagement and our listening all shuts down. So in the stretch zone, that's the opportunity for learning and growth. So the stretch zone literally stretches us and expands our comfort zone. And so the awareness of what zone I'm in, it's almost critical to, am I actually learning and growing in the ways that I want to be? So even taking inventory or quantifying, where am I spending my time day to day? Helpful to know, like, oh, I spend most of my time in my comfort zone. And what am I doing to actually stretch myself? There's all these, I love, reading these, it's just a math problem, but the idea that, like, even if I'm growing 0.1% a day, or even 0.01% a day, and then you compound that over 365 days, like, how quickly do you become a completely new person? Because the compounding effect of those little changes, those little stretches, are enormous. And if you're doing the opposite, if you are shrinking by 0.1, 0.01%, how quickly you would become much smaller. So it's so critical. How am I actually expanding beyond my comfort zone? I had an experience in my first job out of college where we were at an offsite. It was a sort of a ropes course. We were in consulting. We all came together as a group of analysts, and the facilitator talked about comfort zones, and he used the way I think about this comfort, stretch, and panic. The visual is basically like a dartboard. The zones your comfort zone is your inner circle, and your stretch is outside of that. And then your panic zone is the furthest concentric circle outside of that. So that's the image that I hold with the, comfort, stretch, and panic. And he gave us a different image of the comfort zone, where he described it as, think about your comfort zone like two walls on either side of you that are closing in naturally over time. And we have to actively push against those walls just to maintain the same comfort zone. And if we're not actively pushing against those walls, then we'll find our comfort zone narrowing over time. And so this is the idea of, so how does the awareness of where I'm at help me? If you think about living primarily in our comfort zone, that's kind of like the shrinking 0.01% every single day, your comfort zone narrowing, versus the opposite. Actually, what happens to those two walls on either side of you? If they're narrowing slightly every day, what does my life become? And what's the opposite? If they're growing slightly every day, it's almost like I end up at a one point in one situation, and in the other, I end up at like the expansion of the entire universe, right?
Yeah, the idea is, well, first of all, for people who might be listening to audio, Vipin was just doing some incredible things with his hands to illustrate all of this. But I think it was clear enough verbally. And the idea is that there really is no such state as a static state. So either if we're not growing, then we're contracting.
Yeah. And so, like, identifying what would genuinely stretch me, and then also what would make me panic, and committing to situations and actions that would stretch me, and having trusted people in my life to help and to hold me accountable.
So this framework is really about gaining self-awareness. I want to bring in the ego here, because the ego is always at the centerpiece of our podcast and our work at Upbuild. So how does the ego fit into this framework?
First of all, if we don't go to the end of our limits, we won't know what's possible for ourselves. And the mind, the ego, the inner critic gives us infinite reasons to stay in our comfort zone. You can think about, we've all heard the voice inside our heads telling us, you're not good at that. That's not you. You shouldn't try that. Who do you think you are? You should play it safe. That's a refrain that many of us are familiar with. And the difference between those who are living up to their potential and those of us who are not is those who are haven't let their minds and egos hold them as smaller than they are, right? Saying, oh, I've got to listen to those messages and I better stay in my comfort zone. Because, as we talk about at Upbuild all the time, remember, the soul is free, is unconstrained by a lot of the things that we would be feeling uncomfortable by or even panicked with. And it's our minds and our egos and our inner critics that create our self-limiting beliefs. So I was sharing this with you right before we got on this podcast, that I think most people actually live between comfort and panic. And of course, most people love to be in their comfort zones, right? I love to be in my comfort zone where I know what I'm doing. I feel good about myself. That feels good. I feel successful. And then as soon as we get outside of our comfort zone, we panic, which causes us to stay and live in our comfort zone. And if we don't stretch ourselves, if we don't get uncomfortable, we'll never actually know what's possible.
Yeah, so it's really the ego that makes us feel like anytime we're outside of the comfort zone, it makes it feel like we're in the panic zone. And if we can work on our egos, there's the possibility of that experience being more like a stretch zone experience as opposed to a panic zone experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think about it from a survival standpoint, most of the things that we're talking about, almost all of the things that we're talking about that put us in our stretch and our panic zone, they're not survival things. It's not life or death, right? It's actually maybe a lot of fear of shame, fear of failure, but there's also the adage that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Like these are all, but we've all had experiences that give us so much trauma that we don't want to ever go anywhere near something like that. So we want to be very intelligent about how we stretch ourselves. And therefore the idea of a panic zone is really helpful. But none of the stuff that we're talking about is really about survival.
Yeah, I have a client, and one of the things that we're working on is his presence at their investment committees that he attends quite often. And as he's becoming more and more senior, he needs to speak at these investment committee meetings and have a presence there. And for him, those feel like panic zone experiences. That is his visceral reaction to them. His body, his heart rate, all of those things would indicate that it is a panic zone experience for him. And one of the things that we're seeing over time is that the reason why it feels that way for him is because he's looking at it from a very now perspective. It feels like if I don't succeed at this particular investment committee meeting, or if it doesn't go so well, or if people have a negative opinion, that's going to have disastrous consequences for my career. But what happens when we start to zoom out a little bit and we see that these are actually the reps that he needs in order to actually get where he wants to go in his career? It can just start to shift the experience of, oh my God, what happens right now to me here with these consequences, to this is actually a necessary experience for my growth. And then some of that fight or flight can start to dissipate.
Yeah, I can completely relate to that experience. What it reminds me of most poignantly is my experience in business school, where you're in a section of 90 people and the whole grade and the whole experience is based on your participation. And anytime you say something, there's 89 other people who are trying to either deconstruct it, tear it down, and sometimes build on top of it, but it feels like highly vulnerable to put anything out there for some, including myself. And think about like, what are that's in some ways a very safe environment. What are the consequences? The grades are, you don't even get grades. It's like 90% of the people just get a check mark. So, but yet it felt like in the beginning, a lot of fight or flight. And a lot, that is what story do I tell about what's happening here and how will people perceive me? And this is really understanding what's at stake and how do I reframe what's at stake, like the way that you've done with your client. I mean, the other thing is working on what are the strategies that I can employ to break this down into some babyier steps to start to give me, again, to make it feel more like if that feels like panic, what's in my stretch zone here? And one of the typical strategies that advisors would give to business school students who are all, like so many of us, in the same boat would be get in early into the conversation early because it reduces the pressure, right? And so we would call these chip shots in business school, where you just throw in it's like professors asking for like basic data in the case. So you don't even have to give a real opinion. You're just you're just regurgitating data. But the idea of getting your voice in reduces the threshold. Like, oh, I've now participated. Maybe easier to get in later in the conversation without feeling the buildup of I haven't spoken. It's 40 minutes in. I better say something so profound at this point. And like that pressure becomes a barrier. This idea of chip shots, I've shared with many other clients, actually, because it's relevant in many situations that people experience at work, where they're like, yeah, I feel like I don't have the presence I want in that executive committee meeting or investment committee or the executive team. This is awareness of like, what's my comfort zone? What's outside of it? What's a specific way in which I can start to dip into my stretch zone without being paralyzed by panic?
That's great. What else would you say to someone who is thinking about how they might be able to expand their comfort zone and spend more time in the stretch zone?
I want to share an example, a personal example that I think may be instructive around this question, and definitely relates to, your question about how does the ego fit in. So, you were saying I was just at this Kirtan festival this past weekend, and it was reminding me of a Kirtan experience you and I had together last year when we went on.
Could you just share what a Kirtan is, so in case people don't know?
Yeah, of course. Kirtan is devotional singing. So you're chanting a mantra repeatedly, and it's expressing your devotion to God, the divine. And so, the experience is meant to be very meditative and to build your faith and your longing for that in that relationship. Does that help?
That helps a lot, yeah.
If you remember, Gauravani, who was the person leading this particular kirtan. Usually these kirtans go for an hour at a time, and after each hour, a new person comes in to lead the kirtan, and they're all incredible singers and musicians. And so Gauravani is one of the most, and he was leading this kirtan. So he has a way of really bringing in the whole room, like really bringing in the participation. And one of the ways he does that is, the whole kirtan is done in a call and response way. So the person who's leading sings the mantra, and then everybody else then repeats it back in the same melody that the leader is singing in. And then at some point, he takes one of the mics and he starts handing it around to all of those around him to lead the next mantra. So, and then hear the response from the room. And then somebody else would take the mic and lead the next one. And so at first I was still comfortable because it was the people closest to the musicians who are all incredible musicians. And you and I and Rosnath were sitting pretty far. I don't know if you remember this moment, but it's funny. It's like when we get into these panic zones, those memories are like firmly imprinted on our minds, right? So he's handing the mic, but then the mic keeps traveling further and further and coming closer and closer to us. And I start getting more and more uncomfortable. And at some point, Gauravani and I had really met and talked for the first time on that retreat. And so he knew me more than he had before. And I was trying to avoid eye contact with him because I didn't want him to call my name and have me have to lead even one line of that singing, of the chanting. And that happened. He looks at me and he says my name. And I panicked big time. I was so scared. And I remember I just handed the mic to Rasanath and was like, Rasanath, you have to do this. And in reflection, I was thinking, what was I so scared of that people would think I'm a bad singer, right? I already know I'm not a good singer. So like that, and you and I have shared, I had an experience as a middle school kid in like choir where the music teacher was like, someone is singing way out of tune. And he identified that was me. And he asked me to not sing for the rest of that song. And that was a very traumatic experience for me. And I've carried that ever since. So I avoid singing in front of anyone. And so I'm in that situation and I'm so scared. And I was thinking, what am I so scared of? And again, that people would think I'm a bad singer.
Is there anything else that you were scared of? Like any other ego stuff that we might be able to identify that could have been even deeper than I'm a bad singer?
I mean, I think there are a lot of things around that but I think that's the prime, like I wouldn't be able to carry the tune, carry the melody. Yeah, I would look stupid. I mean, I think it all related to my ability to do this in the right way, to do it well. Because like, so I was going to say, I already know I'm not a great singer. And a large part of that is because I haven't practiced singing much. It's not like, if you think about what's in our experience, in our comfort zone, I don't sing much. I definitely don't sing in front of other people at all. And another is because part of it is because I don't think I'm a good singer. That also becomes self-fulfilling. But I was thinking, how many other things am I avoiding in my life because I don't think I'll be good at it? And I was like, this is an environment where it's so, even though I don't know a lot of these people and there are more than 100 people there, it's so supportive. I've heard other people sing and people just appreciate the effort. And you can see people going outside of their comfort zone over and over again. And those who go even it's so visible, they go outside of their comfort zone, they get even more applause for doing that, right? And yet I was, I couldn't do it. I was frozen in that moment. And I've thought about that since that year. And I was thinking, how do I thought I want to work on this. When the next time that happens, I want to be able to, I know I'm not going to be like singing from the top of my lungs and being so comfortable, but I want to be able to take the mic and be in that experience because I think it will do something for me that's really valuable. And so I've thought about my stretch zone over this last year. And so I'm at this Kirtan festival this past weekend. And we didn't have an experience like that, but I was singing unabashedly for 20 hours with whoever was around me because I'm like, this is not about being a famous musician. I'm missing the point if that's what I'm focused on.
Beautiful. Yeah, so clear how the ego got in the way. I should be good, whether it's I should have a good voice or I should be devotional and I should be able to carry a tune. I should be good at this thing.
I want to be good. I want to be good at everything I do. And so if I'm going to, so that's what keeps us in our comfort zone.
Well, the reason why I asked that question about ego before is I'm in the exact same boat as you. I had a very similar experience at the same time. And I definitely don't have an identity of I'm good at this and I'm not pretending to be.
Yeah, sorry, just to clarify, when you said you had the same experience, you're talking about the experience
when the mics got passed around. Yeah. I don't know if it was exactly the same experience, but at the same retreat as this when the mics got passed around. I felt the nervousness. I didn't want it to come near me, all of that stuff. But I don't have an identity of being a good singer. So that identity doesn't feel like it's at stake, but there's still something there, like wanting to belong and feeling like I needed to prove that I belong and that I would need to have some base level of being able to be devotional enough. Like there's something deep inside me I felt like that was going to be exposed if the mic got passed, besides just the quality of my voice and the quality of my singing. It would be like I don't belong here. And that's very deep. That's very deep. And I think that's probably something my client experiences with investment committee meetings. I've experienced that at Upbuild workshops, especially earlier on when I was newer to being a facilitator. And I still experience it sometimes. But there's this deep fear of rejection that I think keeps us in the comfort zone a lot of times.
Love this point about belonging. And if you think about like the idea of what is the holding environment that will allow me to be more in my stretch zone, it's one in which I feel secure in my belonging. And that will allow me to then take more risks, make mistakes, because my belonging is not at stake, right? That's a very powerful insight.
And I see it. I mean, a lot of parents probably have this experience with kids where they have dance parties or singing parties with their kids. And when I'm just my son and I, it's unabashed in the singing because I feel that we belong and there's a family and there's I'm relationally, there's nothing at stake here. So then I can just be free and be me. And I think when we feel like there's something relationally at stake, that's where we get limited.
Yeah, I love that.
As we start to bring this conversation to a close, what are some tactical ways that we can actually use this framework?
Two thoughts. One is from an individual standpoint, I think increasing your awareness of what zones you're living in can be so helpful, as I think we've illustrated in this conversation. So for a week, track what situations are in your comfort, stretch, and panic zones. Or if that's too much, do it for a day and see if you want to make any shifts. And then I think there is another question of what can you do as a leader or a manager to encourage this with your teams. And I think that comes down to something that we talk about a lot at Upbuild, which is you have to create the highest trust environment that you can, where people feel safe taking risks, making mistakes, so they're more willing to try new and harder things, and they're confident that the team has their back, and they don't feel the need to hide their weaknesses, so their insecurities don't become as self-limiting. And I think that is something that you have to do very intentionally. You have to celebrate people who are intentionally going outside of their comfort zones to learn and grow, irrespective of the outcome. And then coaching direct reports to identify areas of growth and specific next steps for themselves is all part of creating that environment.
Yeah, and so you shared two ways to do this on an individual level, figuring out where I'm at on the you are here point on the map, and then figuring out where do I want to go, what do I need to do to move in the stretch zone. In some ways, you modeled that so beautifully when you talked about your experience at the retreat. And then secondly, which was also instructive from your retreat example of having an environment where the process is celebrated of moving into the stretch zone. So you said that when you saw other people take the microphone and they may not have had the best voice, but they sang with a lot of devotion and passion and maybe even squeaked a couple of effort. You heard the effort, which was not a quality singing voice, but you still heard the effort. That was actually celebrated even more. And what that does for people who are watching and also for the people who get the celebration themselves, they feel that sense of belonging inherently rather than it need to be earned. And so from that place, I can take many more risks.
Well, what I experienced was you could taste the encouragement that was being given to that person. You could sense the need for the encouragement, maybe a little bit, but you could taste the overwhelming encouragement that the environment provided, and that affects that person. Like when I have that experience of being overwhelmed by encouragement, I'm ready to step in the arena again and again and again. That's so powerful. And like you're saying, when other people are observing that too, it gives them more courage to do the same thing.
Beautiful. Well, I'm taking away from this conversation, first of all, a much more concrete understanding of what these zones are all about. And what you shared is so poignant around how most of us either spend time in our comfort zone and anything else outside of that feels like panic zone. So I'm taking away with me this desire to move outside of my comfort zone and really introspect and question myself about whether is this really a panic zone situation, or how might I be able to shift my perspective or see how the ego is getting in the way, or do the same thing in an environment where I feel more of a sense of trust and belonging, so that it goes from a typical panic zone experience to something that is a stretch zone experience where I can experience more of that presence and that growth.
Maybe we can close with just one piece of wisdom, an important piece of wisdom that Sachinandan Swami, who's Hari Prasad's guru and a very influential figure at Upbuild across the board, shared with us in this retreat this weekend. So he said, this is a secret. If you want to have some mercy that brings you beyond your own limits. And he was talking about it in the context of Kirtan. But he said, this is a secret. And he was encouraging people to not be shy, to go all the way to their limitations, that never hesitate to give everything that you have, and not to give in to so easily to the little world of the comfort zone, which is so limited by nature. And he said, first, you have to use everything you have, and then you may experience that mercy can pull you even beyond your limits. But that won't ever happen unless you use everything that you have first. So I think it, to me, was really inspiring to know, like, what am I giving in the things that I'm doing for myself and for other people? We've given so much. We have been given so much. How am I using all of that to the extent possible to serve the people in my life? And then to see what's possible when I reach the end of my limits. And it really inspired me to say, like, yeah, I want to do that in all dimensions of my life.
Well, thank you for sharing your wisdom today, and for also sharing your very heartfelt and relatable examples.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for all your questions. And I really appreciated this conversation. I've actually gained more clarity about the zones from this conversation.
And thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you for listening to Upbuilding the Self. Upbuild is a leadership development company that offers workshops, coaching, and other services to help you on the path towards being your best self, free from the shackles of the ego. To learn more about our work, visit our website, upbuild.com, and sign up for our newsletter to gain access to podcasts, reflections, and upcoming events. If you enjoyed this episode, please go to iTunes to leave us a review so that others can find and benefit from the podcast. We look forward to being with you again next time.